So now we're going to start with sample 19, our flat felled seam. So this is that seam that's going to be on your jeans, right? So typically you would have this with denim thread, which is some type of gold thread. It's a little bit thicker, but it's this same concept. So once again, we're going to have our wrong sides together. And so this part is kind of a pick your own journey. If you want to go a little bit more advanced, the proper way is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then you want to like tucking in on itself. If you want it to be a little bit more easier the first few times you do this, do a 5/8 of an inch, because then that gives you more fabric to fold over. So both are perfectly fine for this. If you're actually like sewing your pattern, just know if you are adjusting that, you need to adjust, like you have to do that before you cut out the fabric. Otherwise, it's not going to be the correct size because you're either adding or taking away fabric. So we line this up. We have our wrong sides together, right sides are on the outside. And so I'll go and show you what the 5/8 looks like. So once again, halfway between my 1/2 inch line and my 3/4 inch line, line that up. 12 SPI. I'm just going to do a straight stitch, back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Oh, this is like wrapped around itself. There we go. And I will say for all of your samples, if you've been so used to the 1/2 inch seam allowance, the 5/8 does look big. Because that's part of like when we start to sew more, and especially if you stick to one particular seam allowance, the other, you can kind of start to recognize that, and the others you're like, ooh, that just looks wrong. But for this, because that's what we're going for, is 5/8 of an inch. And I will say part of it is this plaid does also make it look bigger than what it is. So once again, we're going to trim those threads, and now we're going to take it over to the iron. This one's a little like precarious to the edge. So what you're going to do, instead of busting the seam open, you're pressing it to one side. Okay? So it really doesn't matter if you want to get real technical, because your top stitching and your bottom stitching always look slightly different. So if you want them to look very similar, you would press it to the way where the top stitch from this was also matching up with the top stitch on your fabric. Another thing that you could do if you don't want to do that, because that's like a very like niche nitpicky thing that you do not have to do. If you notice, like when you kind of like spread it, notice it's already kind of like tilting to one side. You could just press with that because you're not fighting in the fabric, right? Like this is part of that, like when I was saying like the fabric speaks situation, is it's already kind of telling you the way it wants, and so you don't have to, you're not going to be fighting it, and that will just kind of let it do its thing a little bit more naturally. And so I would do recommend using the tailor's block for this, or pressing block, to get a really nice flat for all of these. So you can kind of just start by getting a little preheated, and you want to make sure that it's flat. And once again, I will say, just a little heads up, with because of the fact that this print is warped, it will, when you start to look at it, start to mess with your eyes, because you start to think that like you sewed it wrong. And that's just because you're looking at the print and not like the grain line of the fabric. So just a little precursor, but I didn't want to waste this fabric because A, like we've been talking about sustainability, but then B, that is more of y'all's material fee that like, I think when I did the math, if I would have done this, then y'all couldn't have had the bobbin cases. So then, like I was telling people, in order, if you wanted to come in after class time, you would have to be like read out either when I was here, I would have schedule time, and you would like check out a bobbin case, which, I mean, is doable. It's what we did last year, but it does make it a little bit more inconvenient. So if you don't remember, all the tailor's block or pressing blocks do is it kind of keeps that heat and it cools it down and it keeps it pressed how you want it. So if you're wanting it really flat, especially if it's one that's like fighting you, you could apply pressure the whole time it's cooling down. And so it's just kind of like your hair, like especially I know like when a lot of people do like the flat irons for like the curls, and you like want to put it back up until it sets. The same thing's happening with these fibers, because a lot of your textile fibers honestly react and work the same way as like your hair. So that kind of like same principle. So that's how come like moving it when it's hot can actually make the fabric not be as nice and sharp as you're wanting it to be. So that means if I'm doing that, I'm going to do this to the bottom side. So just give me a little press with the heat. I'm gonna let that out. So you're now about to like tuck this in, but especially since you got it really nice pressed and flat, just know if you're still like have filling in your fingers, which good for you, we want to try and keep that, then know that whenever you lift this up, there's going to be a lot of heat because it's going to stay like where that's picked up. So some things that you can do is kind of like pick it up, waft it a little bit, and then kind of like to let that heat come out. So even if you don't use the tailor's block, do not immediately start going and folding it over unless you've already lost all the feeling in your fingers. If you haven't, that's how you get rid of that in a not fun way. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fold this into itself where it's all nice and flat. And this is the part where like doing the 5/8 of an inch gives you a little bit more extra fabric, so it makes this part easier. So that's the only difference between the 5/8 of an inch and the 1/2 inch is when you get to this part. And so it's easier with the 5/8 because you have more fabric that you're working on folding over in itself. And just to make sure it's nice and even, I always just like go and push it into its edge so it's folded in half. And that's why like a straight seam, making sure it's straight, is really helpful, because then you know that this part is. And so it's helpful if you kind of get it all started, but you'll want to do about half of it, press that, and then double check the other one before you press the other half. And so you want to get closer, and you can kind of like move your finger away as we're checking that. So I'm going to let this stay, and you will need the heat a little bit longer because it's now going through more layers of fabric to get that heat. But you don't want it too long because you can start to scorch the fabric or melt your thread, since this is a polyester thread. And so I do press back over kind of like where the end was, because there is less heat towards the tip of the iron, but then that way we make sure that the whole thing, especially with it being a cone shape. And so once again, we just kind of make sure. And we go and press. And then after I do both sides, I go and I kind of like just press the whole thing again, now that the parts have actually been like pressed down. Just kind of like smooth the things, but then also make sure it's all pressed even. So some people will do this without pressing. I find it harder when you do the flat filled, because these are essentially just serve as your lines to guide you. So now you just go back in over here, and once again, this might be a thing like you kind of like let this kind of waft, because you're going to be putting your fingers here to line it up so that you get that heat out. And so we're still going to do 12 SPI, but now instead of like a specific seam allowance or seam gauge, you're going to put this in. And I like to line up the edge of my, like where I folded, with that inside right edge of my presser foot, and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. And just like so it's just like my understitching. I'm going pretty close to that edge. And if you still have some, like I should have pressed this more, but I'm kind of speeding it up. You could pin it down, but you should be able to like press it to where it stays flat without pins. And that will make this easier. Make sure to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. And we just keep with that folded edge to the inside of the presser foot on the right side. So you make sure you have it fully folded over so that's going through all of the layers of fabric. So then you just trim your threads and you give it one final press to set those last stitches. And you have a flat felt seam. So if anyone wants to come see this, they can.